Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Inequality Watch. Remember, this show is about the most existential threat to our humanity, our country's ever-expansive income inequality. It's an imbalance at the root of many social ills: climate change, poverty, over-policing, and inadequate health care, to name a few, which is why our job here is to hold the political system owned and operated by the 1% accountable. To do so, we can take real examples of greed and avarice and drill down to unearth the corruption and cronyism that make it possible. And then we do what good journalists should do: hold the people responsible accountable. And today we're going to scrutinize an issue that could not be more illustrative of the show's topic. Imagine for a moment you were rich beyond imagination, that you had access to almost incalculable wealth. But there was a catch. The community where you constructed your shiny mansion on the hill was distressed. All around you, the ravages of poverty had caused crime, shorter lifespans, crumbling infrastructure, and an educational system that you wouldn't even send your own kids to. Now imagine that you were part of the problem. Because of a quirk in the tax law, you didn't have to pay a single dime in property taxes. So even though you were getting richer by the minute, the world around you was falling apart. In fact, things were so bad you had to hire your own police force, the first step toward the dystopian nightmare that we only read about in science fiction novels. At some point, if you were paying attention, you might think to come to the conclusion that would help to pitch in, that even though the law did not require you to do so, all your astounding wealth won't matter much if the city where you lived was slowly dying. Well, the scenario I just described actually exists right here in our hometown of Baltimore. In fact, all you have to do is drive about 2 miles from our studio to see the type of conditions I described firsthand. When you do, you'll drive right onto the campus of Johns Hopkins Hospital, an institution that is consistently ranked one of the best in the world. But surrounding this oasis of wealth is an abject picture of poverty. If you look at the images I'm showing on the screen now, you can see that the neighborhoods surrounding Hopkins have not benefited from their proximity. In fact, even though a plan called the East Baltimore Development Initiative has poured tens of millions of dollars into developing the area, rows of homes still sit vacant. But what's really amazing about this story is a fact that rarely makes headlines. That's because Hopkins is a nonprofit. So the sprawling campus you see on the screen does not pay property taxes, meaning that the institution that generates billions of dollars a year contributes very little to services like police and fire. It is the poorer neighborhoods that surround it that must foot the bill. But there is a movement now to change that equation, a push by city officials to get Hopkins and 19 other wealthy institutions to contribute more to fund the services they use. But it's the response by the institutions themselves and the mayor, which we will be focusing on today. And today I'm joined by TRN reporters Stephen Janis and Jezl Noor. So Stephen, can you give us an overview? These institutions pay very little. Can you give us some of the details?
Well, you know, because they're nonprofits, they're exempt from property taxes. But in 2016, they cut a deal with the city, which was renewal of a deal, a memorandum of understanding, where they agreed to contribute total $6 million between about 19 institutions, which was divided between hospitals and universities. And the idea was, it was called a pilot, which is a payment in lieu of taxes, which is the idea that, well, we don't have to pay taxes, but we'll voluntarily give you money so that we can offset some of the services that the city, that we need, as well as everyone else, you know, fire, police, whatever. And this was an extension of agreement that was codified under the previous Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, and it's stated about $6 million a year, I think, since then. So they pay very, very little when you consider how much property that they own. But they have been doing this, and it's really not going to be adequate because of some of the upcoming funding obligations that the city had that I think Jezl can talk about.
Well, Jezl, Baltimore has all these institutions that are nonprofits, and they're incredibly wealthy. What do these institutions say when they're asked to pay their fair share?
So I reached out to Johns Hopkins, and because they're one of the largest, between the hospital and the university, they're one of the largest nonprofit tax-exempt landowners. They're sitting on billions of dollars worth of property, and as Stephen said, they're paying a little more than half of the $6 million that the nonprofits are per year. The nonprofits are giving voluntarily instead of property taxes. So I reached out to them, you know, and so Hopkins emphasized that, you know, they're deeply committed to the city. About 16,000 of their employees, which is like less than half, live in the city, so they pay property taxes. And you know, they also talk about the $24 million that the hospitals, Bayview and Johns Hopkins Hospital pay in other non-exempt property taxes and things like parking fees. But then you have critics, and there was like a recent protest at City Hall demanding that the city re-examine this deal. And so, like in the words of Lawrence Brown, he said, "You can't give charity but deny justice."
Now, Jessel, the council actually has put out a resolution that is supposed to ask some of these institutions to pay a little bit more money. Tell me about this resolution and what kind of impact you think it's going to have.
So the timing of the resolution is interesting because it comes a few weeks after the Kirwan Commission released. And first of all, the Kirwan Commission is a statewide panel that looked at best practices and in public education around the country and the world, and it found that the state of Maryland is underfunding its schools by billions of dollars every year. And so to make Maryland schools, model schools, like some of the best schools in the country, they said the state and local jurisdictions need to increase their contributions. Now, as viewers of the show probably know, Baltimore City spends way more on things like police and public education, and that's been a trend that's been going on for years.
Very true.
And so the study found that Baltimore City schools are underfunded both by the state and by the city. So according to the commission, they said Baltimore City needs to increase its contributions to its own public schools by $330 million a year.
That's a huge increase.
By 2030, which is a huge amount of money. Some people say that's way too much. The city can do more, but that's way too much. But I think now, local council people are looking at this issue. Where can we get that increased money from? And these nonprofits, this pilot agreement is less than 5%. The $6 million is less than 5% they would pay.
One thing, Jessel's done a lot of good reporting about one of our local media organizations, and this is a point we like to make on the Inequality Watch, and they have been saying that Baltimore City schools are way overfunded. And Jessel's done some great reporting about how that's just not true, and this really proves what you've been saying. I mean, the fact that the Kirwan Commission said, we're not just talking about tens of millions, we're talking about hundreds of millions, right? I mean, it's
absolutely.
the city has spent all its money on policing and just totally neglected, correct?
So for years, we've known that Baltimore schools are underfunded. This was upheld by a judge in 1996.
Right.
And even recently, in the last few years, studies have found that Baltimore City schools are underfunded by hundreds of millions of dollars a year. But then you have conservative outlets like Fox 45. You have libertarian.
Which is part of Sinclair Broadcasting.
Sinclair Broadcasting.
Right.
So they're known for their,
right-wing, absolutely right-wing, extremist,
right-wing, essentially propaganda that some of their own commentators have called out for being blatantly racist. But so you have on one hand their national work, but also on a local level, the rich are obsessed with public schools, and essentially they're obsessed with public education as one of the few institutions that remains unionized. And so part of their agenda, as we've reported on, is attacking the schools not as underfunded, but with a lack of accountability. So their solution is privatization, is privately run charter schools, and to de-unionize schools. But that really hasn't worked anywhere it's been tried. Betsy DeVos, who's a big backer of this, the billionaire heiress, she tried it in Michigan, and now we've found in Michigan, which is ground zero for a lot of these reforms, has some of the worst student gains in the country. So that is essentially their agenda. Schools are not underfunded.
Bring it to Baltimore.
Yeah, schools are not underfunded. They need privatization, but the track record is really poor.
Wow. Stephen, after the recession hit, nonprofits are what moved in to sort of bring money into cities. They really were the only businesses that were able to flourish. So what are we looking at now with the state of nonprofits in Baltimore and Maryland? I
mean, basically, I think, and Jessel, you can tell me if this number is correct, I think it's roughly about 25% of all the property in Baltimore.
It's actually 30%.
It's 30%.
30%.
So, yeah.
We have one of the highest burdens in the country. We have a disproportionate amount of places that don't pay property taxes.
And I mean, so just for example, if a church buys a piece of property to rent out, like as an apartment, that doesn't get taxed. Now, so that's 30% there. Then we have some of the, as you and I have done investigations on tax breaks, including things like pilots, almost all new apartment buildings built in Baltimore have a 10-year pilot, which means that they don't have to pay taxes, property taxes for about 10 years. So the concentration of nonprofits on top of the city's real generosity with tax breaks has made, what one person we talked to, tax privileged and tax punished population. And the tax privileged are the wealthiest. I mean, the thriving institutions here are mostly nonprofits, right? I mean, there aren't many commercial businesses that can, stand up to a Hopkins, either the university or the hospital. So it's created this strange world where you have this occluded group of very wealthy institutions that just don't contribute anything or anything significant to the overall general services, population, education, whatever. So it's become a bifurcated city in some ways.
You know, Jizzle, some would say nonprofits that provide social services like helping the homeless or the elderly should be tax exempt, but others say if you're using city services, you should pay some form of taxes. What type of, nonprofits do you think should be tax exempt, or which ones should be targeted as a new source of revenue for our city council?
So that's the question that the city is going to have to confront in the next few years. So you've seen the National Nurses put out a report that found that Baltimore's tax base is $51 billion. Nonprofits make up $15.9 billion of that, 30%, one of the highest rates in the country. And so what this means is that homeowners and renters are paying a disproportionate amount of money. They're making a disproportionate amount of that tax base up. We know 30% of renters pay more than a third of their income on rent. It makes it really hard for people to live here. This city is hemorrhaging population. We're expecting to lose tens of thousands of people in the next few years, which is another reason why schools are underfunded.
Exactly.
You see people leaving the city, and it's a cycle because the schools are underfunded, so people want to move away for more schools.
Because the schools are good,
So, and this is a national issue. This isn't just happening in Baltimore. One of the models for how to tackle this is Boston. So interesting about Boston is they have a similar amount of tax-exempt properties, but in their pilot, they asked any nonprofit that has more than $15 million worth of property to pay 25% of the commercial rate. So whereas Baltimore is getting $6 million a year in these contributions, Boston is getting $33.6 million a year. And they have another deal in community benefits where they get $50 million more a year from these same nonprofits. So they're getting $80 million a year, where Baltimore City is getting $6 million a year. A lot of cities are doing it in Virginia. They have a state law, only one in the nation, where any local government can say nonprofits have to pay taxes. And so Maryland is often considered a rival to Northern Virginia, but in many places in Northern Virginia, all nonprofits have to pay property taxes.
Stephen, in Maryland, we have over 30,000 nonprofits, which are generating revenue over $55 billion a year. There's actually one nonprofit for every 180 people. So this is an incredible ratio. So why don't you tell us a little bit about a nonprofit that is a nonprofit program called EBDI?
Well, East Baltimore Development Initiative is something that Johns Hopkins undertook along with local partners, including the city, to try to fix some of the housing infrastructure to the east, or really to the north of the campus, because it was just basically the images we're showing you now. We're showing you what it used to look like, and it still does in many areas. But all of the areas surrounding Hopkins used to look like it completely abandoned and neglected. So EBDI was formed to sort of funnel money into this idea that we're going to rebuild some of the neighborhoods around Hopkins. But it was very interesting because a lot of it got stalled because they wanted to put money and they wanted to build sort of upscale homes that would cost $200,000 or $300,000. And it started about the time of the Great Recession. And so it's been very slow. And then of course, they got a TIF from the city, a $90 million TIF, which is a tax break on top of that. So instead of putting their own money into it, they went to the city and said, give us more tax dollars, give us tax-free property, and we'll build it. So again, they dipped into that same well that all the other wealthy developers have dipped into. And one of the things that was very interesting that has come up over and over again, this sort of EBDI is a closed organization. They've been giving out contracts using money contributed by the city and other nonprofit organizations to contractors without any sort of public vetting. And it became very controversial. There were actually press conferences by city officials because the people from EBDI would not say how they picked such and such a developer. And one of the arguments was that all the developers came from outside the city. So this is something, and we've seen it in other tax breaks we've done. So again, it's something that purports to be some sort of civic benefit. Yeah.
Now, we spoke with Mayor Young, and we asked him about, asking nonprofits to contribute,
well,
in particular, Johns Hopkins University. Why don't you tell us about the response that Mayor Young gave us?
Because, really, as Jizzle pointed out, the mayor is the ultimate arbiter on this. I mean, the mayor is going to be the one that makes the decision. Baltimore has a very powerful mayoralty, so he's going to be so we wanted to ask him. We wanted to ask him specifically about Johns Hopkins. Number one, as Jizzle pointed out, they're the biggest, but also because Jack Young, our mayor, worked for Hopkins for like 30 years. So let's listen to what he had to say.
I respect the council for looking at other. I respect the council for looking at other revenue sources that could help us.
You think Hopkins is paying their fair share?
I will, like I said before, I appreciate the council for looking at other revenue streams to help us with all of the looming budget issues that we'll be facing. I'll leave it at that.
So as you can see, he was a little uncomfortable answering, whether or not Johns Hopkins would pay this. But I think that's illustrative of many of these situations because of the interconnectivity, right? It creates corruption. I mean, Jack's mayor, he has benefited from working at Hopkins on the one hand and getting paid by the taxpayers and the council for at least 20 years, let's say, because he was in the council since 1996. And yet, when he knows that they're not paying their fair share because of that, I think, in part because of that conflicted relationship, he refuses to answer the question. So you can see how wealth inequality kind of reinforces itself, right? They hire our politicians who are supposed to represent us, give them jobs that they can keep while they are working on the council. And then when it comes time to make sure that they're paying their fair share, they evade because they're conflicted. You know, how do you expect the system to arbitrate fairly when you have that type of conditions and that kind of setup? So I think his answer is very illustrative of the problem.
Yeah, and another way to illustrate the power of Hopkins is to look at this multi-year campaign they fought to get a private police force. The first year, it fell through because there was widespread community opposition. The second year, they spent $500,000 on lobbying state officials. And despite the protests and opposition of several community groups, and we covered this, there were student marches.
Real protests. I mean,
so the students walked out. They've locked down the one of the
Garland Hall,
the library.
Administrative buildings. They held an occupation there for weeks. The faculty came out, wrote a letter. The undergrad students voted overwhelmingly.
There was a student organization, just specifically geared towards this.
Students Against Private Policing.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they held multiple rallies and marches.
And what Jessel points out is really good. This is just like EBDI. That's a private police force. And what that means is they're not going to be held accountable to the public. They're basically, if the Hopkins president says, go out and do this and arrest somebody, and they'll have arrest powers. Yeah, you make a great point. That it is exactly the problem. It's not a public police department.
Now, Johns Hopkins has also been having a battle internally. There have been nurses that have been organizing for fair hours and fair wages. How has their push for a union gone so far?
So it's interesting because it's been happening for over a year now. And so they went public early last year. And so they have, of course, been met with fierce opposition. So Hopkins has this long history going back to the civil rights movement of fighting unions. So Dr. King's wife came to Baltimore to march on the lines with SEIU workers when they were Coretta Scott King. In the 60s, she came and fought for the workers, SEIU, the janitorial staff. And nurses have tried to unionize in the past. This has been one of their more vocal campaigns. But what they've come up against is what they call a really fierce anti-union campaign. Hopkins has hired one of the top of what's been described union-busting firms in the entire country. And the National Labor Review Board, under Trump, and he stacked it with these pro-business figures, even they ruled that Hopkins was carrying out unfair labor practices.
Really?
But because labor law is so weak, all that meant was for, I think, 60 or 30 days, they had to put up signs saying we will no longer infringe on your right to unionize and talk to each other in the break rooms. Those are gone now. And a lot of nurses that I've talked to are burnt out because it's been going on for so long. They say that they're facing retaliation, and the turnover rate, which is already pretty high there, is increasing. And a lot of folks are just, they're
giving up.
They're giving up, and we'll see what happens. I mean, I know National Nurses hasn't given up, and they're still optimistic on this, but that remains an uphill battle. And so, going back to what Marisela Gomez and Lawrence Brown and these community advocates have been saying for so long is that it's such a contradiction to be a hospital where you're healing the people, but you're also hurting the people that work there, and you're hurting the community with all these deals and not paying their fair share. So it's just this contradiction, and people want them to do better because they are making like medical contributions, but they say they need to stop hurting the city that has also given them so much.
And Tay, one thing that's interesting is that Hopkins is not the only institution that's benefited from this, sort of tax system. The hotel, the Convention Center Hotel, which is backed by the taxpayers, and the hotel, the Marriott Waterfront Hotel, which has a 25-year pilot, which doesn't pay taxes. Both of those institutions have fought unions, do not pay living wages, And we have covered extensively
Unfair
the effort,
hours
unfair
as
hours,
well.
all sorts of stuff. So even though they're benefiting to the max, the city's literally saying, you don't have to contribute to any of the services. We're going to give you police service for free. We're going to give you fire for free.
Right.
We're going to give you park and recs for free. They still don't compensate their workers in a way that makes a living wage. So it really only aggravates the problems in the city.
And it actually, when you don't pay your workers a living wage, that means the taxpayers have to,
provide them services,
provide them
social
services and fill those burdens.
Yes.
You see the high murder rate here, which is tied to inequality.
Yes.
And we just had a ceasefire this weekend, and that's what the youth were saying. They said, leaders address inequality, address these unlivable conditions for so many people in the city, because that's what's driving the murder rate. You're not going to solve this by spending more money on policing. Address the root causes.
I think it's illustrative that being exempt from Baltimore's regionally high tax rate creates a stark visual cue. The city's roughly 16,000 vacant homes, a symbol of the city's decline, are subject to tax, a rate that is twice the amount of the surrounding jurisdiction, Baltimore County. Meanwhile, the nonprofits that do not pay the tax are thriving. In a sense, it's a symbol of the ravages of the nation's extravagant inequality. The rich thrive and live in extravagance while paying lower and lower tax rates. Meanwhile, the wealth of the rest of the country shrinks as people go bankrupt after getting sick, mortgage their future to attend college, and watch their wages barely budge. Meanwhile, wage earners are paying a higher percentage of their income to taxes than hedge fund managers. And even more troubling is the unique civic disconnect the special status creates. Institutions like Johns Hopkins don't have to fund a police department mired in corruption and currently unable to reduce crime. It's not their problem city schools don't have heat or adequate supplies. Why do they care if the city aging water infrastructure needs billions in repair, so long as they don't have to pay the bill? In fact, like the country's uber rich, they can construct an oasis of plenty amid the ravages of neglect, a veritable gated enclave untouched by the despair around them. I wonder, does the president of Hopkins ever take a walk in the East Baltimore neighborhoods that surround him? Do the institutions that build gleaming new buildings and expand their immaculate campuses ever venture into that world of abject poverty and human misery that threatens to engulf their tax-exempt utopias? In a sense, what's happening in Baltimore could serve as a metaphor for the country's record-setting economic inequity. The rich continue to estrange themselves from the collective needs of the community, pay less in taxes, and dominate the political dialogue. Meanwhile, our infrastructure is crumbling, teachers are unpaid, and our healthcare system becomes less and less about healing and more about profit. I want to thank my guests, investigative reporter Jezel Noor and investigative reporter Stephen Janis, for joining me today. I'm your host, Taya Graham, and I want to thank you for joining me for the Inequality Watch. Please like, share, and comment. I really do read your comments. Thank you.